Yeah, they'll catch up. Okay, so all right, thank you very much for coming to my naval metaphors and science fiction talk here at the Armchair Dragoons Digital Convention, and thank you very much to the Armchair Dragoons for inviting me to do this talk. I appreciate it a great deal. And so, a quick little story. It says that I'm the founder of the Society for the Conservation of Angular Momentum. That's actually a joke that got out of hand. I just put it in a SIG one time on the SF ConSmL War Games list, which I'm the founder of. And I just put it because I thought it would be funny to talk about I thought it would be funny to talk about conserving angular momentum, right? The idea that you'd have to actively conserve it as opposed to the fact that it just happens. Well, it got taken as a rallying cry for the idea of realistic physics and tactical space combat games. And so next thing I knew that there was a logo created, and Ken Burnside was printing t-shirts, and there was a web page and all this other stuff, and I didn't get any money for any of it. But I use that as my affiliation when I'm doing something unofficial. So when I use that, it means I'm here speaking only for me. I'm not speaking for any employer, etc. So who exactly am I, and why am I here today? So professionally, I'm a naval analyst. I was an intel analyst for the last for about 9 years. I came back to being primarily a warfare analyst and war game designer analyst. I've primarily been a naval person for most of my career, going back to the last century. But from a science fiction perspective, I've done a lot of interesting things where I describe it as that my fandom superpowers, I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. And so I'm one of the founding members of BU9, which is David Weber's analytic design team for the Honorverse. I was the copy editor and wrote part of House of Steel, the Honorverse companion. I'm currently associated with NavyCon, which is an effort that got started by the US Naval Academy Museum to have people use science fiction case studies to talk about real world national security concerns, usually Navy, but not always. We just launched a podcast called The Joint Geeks of Staff. That is, I think they're currently about to do episode 3, if I remember correctly. I was on the one episode, but we haven't really been doing stuff that's my area of specialty, so I haven't been up to my eyeballs in it. I co-host a show called Starfleet Tactical at 10 p.m. on Saturday nights on the Aries Studio channel on YouTube. That's put out by Alec Peters, the guy behind Star Trek Axanar. My BU9 companion, Pat Doyle, and I talk about a whole bunch of different things. It's not just Star Trek. In fact, we try to talk about Star Trek every episode, but we sometimes fail. I've been a consultant for Chuck Gannon, Tom Harlan, and a bunch of other authors. I got interviewed about aircraft carriers in space and Enterprise versus Enterprise, which compared the real US Navy to Starfleet. And I was an advisor for the Discovery Channel's Alien Invasion, Are We Ready show. Now that started when I was still a professor at the Naval War College. But then I moved, they didn't have me do the on-air stuff until later. They wanted to have me sort of bat cleanup, right? So they recorded a bunch of people early on, but they were going to record other people later in the process to sort of answer any questions that had come up during the production process. So I was in that later tranche of people. And so when it came time to do it, the War College didn't care about the fact that I was going to do this stuff. When it came time to do it, I told DIA Public Affairs, hey, just to let you know, I got this thing going, blah, blah. It's just this cute little thing for the History Channel. Don't worry about it. And they went ape shit. They went absolutely ape shit. I'm getting these emails like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Blah, 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 blah. And it's just like where is this coming from? Well, the answer, I found out fairly quickly what the answer is, and the rest of the world found out about 5 years or so ago, when it was reported that DIA had a group of people looking at UFOs. They had stood up a particular group that was doing analysis about whether UFOs were a real threat or not. And then there was, and my particular office actually had some oversight on some studies that were done looking at various technology stuff, because I worked for the Office of Defense Technology and Long Range Analysis. And so we were responsible for basically saying, yeah, doing the contract management stuff on it, and doing sort of review. And those were all actual, technical documents on like material science issues and stuff like that. Although I constantly heard about DIA being the organization that did the wormholes paper, wormholes and I forget the other part of it. It was like wormholes in space drives or something like that. And I'd always have to say, yeah, that's not just DIA, that's my office that did that. But that's why they freaked out, because they knew that it had the potential to be a politically sensitive thing, and they didn't want it to come out in a way like this. And it's like, no. I didn't even know about this when I signed up for it. So that's who I am, and that's why I'm here today. And I should emphasize, these are my views only. I don't speak for any employer, past, present, presumably future. I don't speak for ACDC, the Armchair Dragoons, and I speak for me, and that's it. So here's what we're going to talk about today. I'm first going to do a little bit of an introduction. We've already started. Talk about some background concepts, then some specific science fiction models of space warfare, and then I'll offer some conclusions in the end. So as far as the introduction goes, I'm going to start off with what I am not talking about today, what this talk isn't about. Then I'll go to what this talk is about, and then I'll give you what's known as a bottom line up front. I'll tell you my conclusions so you can follow along as I'm doing this talk, and you can decide whether you think that I'm making the case or not. So what this talk isn't about. It's not the opinion about anyone but me. I already told you that. It's not a comprehensive discussion, so there's exceptions to every rule. It's an overview. I could do an entire series of talks on this. I could write books on this. And to some degree, Starfleet Tactical is a series of talks about this. And my colleague Pat Doyle and I plan on actually doing our own YouTube channel where we get more into depth and some stuff like that. So it's not a comprehensive discussion by any stretch of the imagination. I'm also emphatically not saying that there's a right way and a wrong way to do things. So, I'm not going to talk about who would win versus, this universe versus that universe. I don't think there's anything really to learn there, because you're going to hear me say multiple times that all of this is highly assumptions dependent. And really, the assumptions are what drive the problem in most cases. And so, there just isn't any point in comparing apples and oranges in this case. I want to highlight some ideas for consideration. I want to take some of the things that I've learned and apply them to science fiction, so that people that enjoy science fiction can learn some stuff about it, and so that science fiction could end up being better in the long run. That's why whenever a science fiction author says, I'd like to ask you some questions about the Navy or this or that or the other thing, yes, the answer is going to be yes. I'm happy to talk with you about that stuff. Some of my favorite shows are the ones that make the least amount, shows and media, et cetera, are the ones that make the least amount of sense. I love the Warhammer 40K background. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. None of that makes any sense. But that doesn't mean it's not fun. So some of my my favorites are some of the worst quote unquote offenders in terms of like not being realistic, but that's okay. I will say, on the other hand, disbelief should be suspended but not lynched, which means, I don't use 40K. I don't analyze 40K. I don't analyze Star Wars, because I really don't think that there's anything to be learned by analyzing those universes. They don't make sense. And I can still watch them. I can still enjoy them, but I don't feel like I have anything to offer in explanation as to how they work, because I think how they work is really pretty arbitrary. Nothing I say should prevent anybody from enjoying anything. Like what you like. I hope that you can look at it with a little bit more of a practiced eye and sort of understand the implications of it a bit more. But I don't want anybody to come away from this saying, Chris says this is stupid and you shouldn't like it, because that's really not my goal. So I do want to talk about one other thing about that this talk isn't about, and I think it's because it was mentioned early on in some of the material for the conference, and that is why am I not going to talk about Space Force? The US just created a new branch of the Armed Services, Space Force, and I'm really not going to talk about it for a bunch of reasons. First of all, I'm really talking about science fiction, space combat, and that's really not what this is about. Space Force is about the acquisition process and the management of the assets. It's not really about warfighting as an independent warfighting domain. Some of that may happen somewhere down the road. It's something that people are concerned about. You can go and read all the stuff, Google the topic, and you can see that there's articles going back for decades on when is this going to happen, and you know, we've developed this kind of space weapon and they've developed that kind of space weapon, et cetera, et cetera. But there's nothing that really looks like, you know, the US Navy is going to conduct an amphibious operation. There's no Space Force equivalent of that, and there isn't going to be for a long, long time. Air and space systems are really very different. They don't sort of cross those boundaries. You know, ballistic missiles go, you know, operate totally differently than airplanes. They really, you know, satellites operate totally differently than airplanes. They're really sort of two separate things. And that's really kind of why they split them apart, to make it easier to manage them. And as a result, we're ending up with sister services, both within the Department of the Air Force. So it's going to be like the Navy and the Marine Corps are both part of the Department of the Navy. The Space Force and the Air Force are both part of the Department of the Air Force. So, and the last reason I'm not really going to talk about this is because even if it were something that really sort of fit into the background of this talk, it's really too close to my day job. And by that, I mean, if I spend any time talking about my views about Space Force in any sort of depth, anything more than I'm doing in this talk, means I have to go through the public affairs office of my current agency. And, you know, I'm not even mentioning my current agency. I don't want to have to go through the public affairs office of my current agency. I want to talk about science fiction. I don't want to talk about the day job. So I'm specifically avoiding talking about the day job. So I'm not going to talk about Space Force. I am going to talk about things, information that I think might be interesting, and this is an opportunity for me to pass that along to you, because I spent a lot of time when I was at the Center for Naval Analysis, going out to sea, seeing the US Navy up close and personal. I've got 87 days of sea time. I've landed on aircraft carriers. I've taken off of aircraft carriers, flew in a helicopter, hunted submarines, did a whole bunch of really cool stuff. And then I was a professor at the US Naval War College, where I also got their degree in national security studies. And so, you know, I had an opportunity to work on a lot of really cool stuff. And then I was an intel officer at DIA for 9 years and got a chance to do some cool stuff there that I'm really not going to talk to you about. So I've learned some interesting things that I'd like to pass along, and I'd like to start a discussion about naval warfare and science fiction and how it works. Let me put out this illustration real quick. Those are all to scale. So what we have there is the 2004 Battlestar Galactica, we have the USS Nimitz, and we have the space battleship Yamato. Those are all to scale. The Galactica is effing huge. It never really came across exactly how big that ship is. It is huge. Keep that in mind. So my bottom line up front. Real world ships and fleets are based on real world factors in the universe they inhabit, right? We build ships that have to operate in the real world. We build them based upon the physics of the real world. We build them based upon the political conditions of the real world and the physical conditions of the real world. We use real engineering to do all that stuff. Science fiction ships and fleets often are not based on the universe they inhabit. They don't make sense in terms of how space works. They don't make sense in terms of how the universe is defined internally, oftentimes. In reality, a lot of them are just taking a model, a terrestrial model of naval warfare, and running them through the science fiction converter, sometimes without even turning it on, adding the words "in space" onto the end of it, and just running with it. And frequently when they do that, they pull ideas from all sorts of different time periods of naval history, and ideas that in the real world didn't exist together. not every ship type makes sense at every given time in history. And so pulling all the stuff and sort of mashing it all together ends up with a lot of inconsistencies. And so there's a lot of times where I'll just sort of tilt my head when I'm looking at these things and going, I don't understand why you would think that that would be the way that that would work. So that's kind of my thesis of this. The details, though, are really highly dependent upon your assumptions. There's no real single correct answer, and you can come up with a set of assumptions, some that make more sense, some that make less sense, that can make you do almost anything, right? So within a given set of assumptions, it might make sense within those assumptions. And hopefully by the end of this, you can better understand what those assumptions are. You know, what assumptions would have to be true for this to be true? All right, so now we're going to look at some background and concepts. So I'm going to start off with something I call the three H's, history, hiding, and hydrodynamics. Then I'm going to look at some of the notional attributes of space combat. I'm going to look at a concept called kill chains, which I think is very fundamental to understanding combat in general and science fiction space combat in particular. And then I'm going to look at something that I call a useful observation. So for most of history, there's really only been two general types of warships. You can sort of bin navies into two types of warships: battleships and scouts and auxiliaries. They didn't always call them battleships. They didn't always call them scouts and auxiliaries, but frequently that was the case. And this is certainly true from about the time of the age of fighting sail on. So it might be less true in the time of galleys, more true when you start getting to fighting sail. And so, you know, sailing ships go back to the very beginning of warships, but early warships weren't sail driven. Early warships were driven by oars. And so by the time you get to around, let's call it 1600 or so, it's certainly by 1700, you really have sort of dedicated warships, and you can sort of split into battleships and scouts and auxiliaries. Note that I didn't say escorts. That's going to be important below. There's a lot of changes that take place approximately at the beginning of the 20th century, sort of like 1890 to 1905-ish. One is that you have this new ship-killing weapon called the torpedo and platforms designed to carry it. First, you have torpedo boats, then you have submarines, then you have airplanes. Torpedoes are ship-killing weapons. When you get airplanes, you later get aerial bombs that are theoretically ship-killing weapons. And what do I mean by ship-killing weapon? You don't kill a sailing ship with one shot. You have to batter it to death, right? It's like there's no equivalent of a knockout blow. It's all about body blows and beating the other guy to a pulp to the point where he just sort of says, I'm done, right? Torpedoes and aerial bombs have at least the potential to be ship-killing weapons as sort of their default mode of operation, right? Once you got to explosive shell, there was always the chance that a lucky hit was going to cause something to happen. But I'm not really talking about lucky hits. I'm talking about, like, what do you think it can do as sort of your default planning assumption? When that happened, it forced the creation of escorts. And the difference between an escort and a scout or auxiliary is that an escort is actually designed to fight in the battle. The scouts and auxiliaries really aren't. So like back during the age of fighting sail, you had frigates that would do communication function for the fleet. They do scouting functions for the fleet. But during the course of a battle, their position would be off to one side, relaying flag signals between the various ships. They're not going to be in the line of battle. And that's because they actually were so much weaker than the other ships that putting them in the line of battle actually hurt you. It didn't help you. They were likely to get blown up. They couldn't really contribute to the fight much. Escorts are different. The purpose of escorts is to do specific functions during the battle so that the battle line doesn't have to do it themselves. Note that that doesn't mean that the battle line is incapable of doing those functions. A battleship can defend itself against torpedo boats pretty well, especially once they started putting weapons optimized to shoot at torpedo boats, quick firing guns and the like. The problem, though, is that the battle line wants to optimize against against the enemy battle line, right? It's your main ship killing weapon. You want to optimize it against the other side. You don't want to have to be dealing with this other stuff. So instead you create torpedo boat destroyers to prevent the torpedo boats from getting at you. Then incidentally, in one of the great ironies of navies, somebody said, hey, what if we put some torpedoes on that torpedo boat destroyer? What do we get then? And it turns out that torpedo boat destroyers are better torpedo boats than torpedo boats were. Then you get submarines, and you got to, let's kill the submarines so that we don't have to deal with them. And okay, the torpedo boat destroyers will make them submarine destroyers also. And then you start ending up with the escorts designed specifically to shoot down airplanes when airplanes become a problem. And so, cruisers for a long time, one of their main jobs is shooting down airplanes. So it's all about, having these smaller auxiliary ships that aren't your main gun power. They're not your main, your main force of attack, but they've got an important role to play. The same time all this is happening on, one warfare domain becomes three. You went from just having surface combat to now you got to worry about submarines also. And subsurface combat has its own set of weapon systems, its own set of sensors, et cetera, et cetera. Then you end up with airplanes, and now you've got to deal with airplanes at the same time. And you went from having to think about one problem to two problems to three problems. That's a big deal. All these changes happen at the beginning of the 20th century. It's also worth pointing out that not all ships are created equal. Ships change over time. So what we're seeing here in this picture is those are both battleships. Now, the Oklahoma had been turned into some sort of targeted ship, et cetera. So it had everything basically stripped off of it. So, so that's not Oklahoma in her prime, but they're both battleships. Even Oklahoma in her prime, they're nowhere near to the same capabilities, right? Wisconsin is twice the size, close to twice the size, with a lot longer range guns, harder hitting guns, and plus some other attributes that you can't really see. It's got better armor. It's got much better fire control. In fact, using fire control for what the Oklahoma had is, I'm trying to remember which system they had on board, but it wasn't not something to write home about. But ships became more capable over time, yet they would both be classified as battleships. And that's always important to understand too, is that things change over time, and ship capabilities became much more relevant over time. Most science fiction models, however, have a tendency to reflect mixed time periods. You end up with ships that didn't coexist naturally ending up together. So you might end up with light cruisers and heavy cruisers and battleships and battle cruisers and aircraft carriers and all these different things that have, sometimes those ships all existed at the same time, but their roles were redefined over time. That isn't necessarily reflected in what you saw in the what you see in the science fiction works in question. So that's sort of an overview of how the history of this works. Now let's talk about hiding. Ships hide in 4 different ways. This is modern naval vessels. You can hide behind the curve of the Earth. You can hide behind what I call the interface barrier, the barrier between the sea and the sky. So, submarines are generally invisible to surface ships and airplanes with at least the Mark I Mod 0 eyeball, the original sensor that we had. Even the Mark I eyeball, when you put binoculars in front of it, or Mod 1 eyeball. You generally have to stick a sensor in between the interface barrier to be able to cross that barrier. So submarines have periscopes. Ships have sonars on the lower part of their hull that they can use to listen for or to actually actively ping for submarines. Submarines or airplanes will drop sonobuoys down so that they can listen for submarines. You have to somehow penetrate that interface barrier. You can also use distance in space. And by that, I mean, it's a big ocean and your sensors have a field of view, and your more precise, longer range sensors have your more precise sensors have a tendency to have a smaller field of view The sensors that have a big field of view have a tendency to be somewhat imprecise, so you still have to bring other sensors to bear even if you get an initial detection. This will become important when we talk about kill chains later on. And then finally, you can use low observable features, which, stealthy type stuff, right? Radar absorbing materials, things that may diffuse your infrared signature, things like that. Those help too. Now, this is basically a description of how planet Earth looks. You don't have the curve of the Earth or the interface barrier in space because you're basically dealing with one medium in space. And you don't really have consistently the use of distance in space. It's really sort of dependent upon the technological assumptions of the universe you're talking about. So in some cases, you might say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in other cases, it's like, no, that doesn't make sense. And I'll get into that a little bit more as we move on. The nature of air and water is really essential to how all these things work. Like I always describe an aircraft carrier as being a door. The flight deck of an aircraft carrier is a door between the sea and the sky. An aircraft carrier is a way of having your cake and eating it too. It's a way of having airplanes which move fast. Because they move through the air, they're not moving through the water. They are relatively low power, despite the fact they're moving so fast, just because they can be small and their air is so much less dense, and they can be very powerful, but they're also very short duration. They've got a very limited endurance. They can only carry a small number of weapons, and you need to rearm them and reload them and load them with fuel and stuff like that if you want to, and use them again. You can only use them for a couple of hours at a time. Ships, on the other hand, they can be there for months, but they're slow. They're slow and they're big, and they have other issues too. They're a big target. And so we take advantage of the fact that there's this difference between the sea and the sky in order to maximize the capabilities of both realms. You don't have that in space. In space, you basically just have the one domain that you're working in. So let's talk a little bit about stealth in space, because it's a topic that frequently comes up. There's some people who would argue that there is no such thing as stealth in space because you can detect using infrared technology, you can detect small differences from the background. And so as a result, there's no stealth in space. I would argue that that's highly assumptions dependent for a bunch of different reasons. First of all, you've got a time to detect, right? So it's going to take you some amount of time to do that sweep. And that amount of time depends a lot on your technological assumptions. And it's all well and good to say, I can just, I can do it optically and I can just have, the equivalent of Hubble space telescopes pointing in all directions. Okay, maybe you could do that, but you've got some field of view issues. You've now, the Hubble Space Telescope isn't exactly the sort of thing that I would want to be putting around on a high performance spacecraft, subjecting to multiple Gs, et cetera, et cetera. It worked for launch, but it's not the sort of thing that you can just totally abuse. And so, you may be somewhat limited in what you can actually put out for a sensor. There's also the question of the time available to detect a particular target. So if the idea is that the invading spacecraft comes in at some jump point out beyond the order of Pluto and it uses its magic fusion torch to come to the inner system, and it's sort of plowing along with the big bright flare in back of it for 4 weeks, yeah, I'm going to detect that. I'm going to see it coming. And space combat's going to be one of those things where you say, hey, by the way, we're going to have a battle in 3 weeks. You guys should all be prepared for it. If, on the other hand, you're a Starfleet ship, you come zooming in at multiple times the speed of light and you're just kind of there, well, in Star Trek, it works because the sensors are just as magical as the warp drive. But what if you didn't have a magical sensor? What if your sensors are limited to the speed of light? Could be the first that somebody is there is when their ordnance is hitting you. Because they can see you because you've been giving off information, right? You've been giving off reflected light, et cetera, et cetera. If they come in from faster than light and they show up a light minute away from you, it will be a minute before you can see them. They can see you right now. They can see you a minute ago, so maybe you've left since then using your magic FTL drive, or maybe you're still there, but they've got more information than you do at this point. And that's just the way that works. And so your assumption on exactly how your FTL drive works, if it's in a science fiction series, is critical to this. There's also the idea of understanding the environment. So you're making this assumption that the background of space is cold, you know, that people will say the cosmic background radiation is 3 degrees Kelvin. On average, it's 3 degrees Kelvin. On average. That doesn't mean that it's 3 degrees in every direction. That means that in Earth's solar system, on average, it's 3 degrees. So zodiacal dust gets in the way. There can be other things out there that can confuse sensors. You could be operating in a totally different part of the galaxy, like you're closer to the galactic core and you've got these extra bright light sources, et cetera, et cetera. It may be, you know, none of those things would prevent your scan from happening, but they may slow it down. And as a result of that, you may not actually have the time that you think you do to detect. So, yeah, if you give me an infinite amount of time, I'll be able to detect, almost guaranteed. If you give me, you know, somewhere between infinite and no time, though, that system breaks down. These small differences can really, really matter when you're talking about something as potentially quick-paced as combat. And most of these assumptions about this stuff are often undocumented, right? There's like you know, when you're talking about you can detect something in space, you know, there's this assumption that the cosmic microwave background is uniform and that you know what it is, right? In Earth, we can program it in, so it's like we know that in that direction it's a little bit brighter than in that direction. We can take that into account. If I'm coming to a solar system I've never been to before, I don't know what that background looks like. I remember in the TV show Sequest DSV, at one point the submarine got teleported to another planet. I wasn't really watching it at that point, but you know, I remember hearing about it. And I remember thinking, like, okay, so you've gone to another planet. Now that really, really decreases your capability because you don't have charts. You don't know what the water depth is. On Earth, submarines basically drive around with their headlights off. They have no window. They're basically driving around blind. They just know that the thing they really have to worry about is running into something like an undersea mountain or the seafloor. And they've got charts and they know their position. And so they can go, you know, we're in 1,000 feet of water, we're okay. Or we're in 10,000 feet of water, we're doing great. Oh shit, it's getting, you know, we're getting into shallow water. We need to slow down. When the USS San Francisco hit that underwater mountain, the problem was that was a relatively uncharted section of the Earth. We didn't have good data on it, and they were going too fast through an area that they just didn't have good data on. And so they ended up hitting something, right? So same is true if I'm going to another system. I don't know what things are going to be there in the way, and my sensors are going to have to deal with it. If I've got Star Trek level sensors, no problem. I can detect all that shit from a light year away, and it's just magic. It's magic all the way down. If I don't have Star Trek level sensors, I have to kind of, you know, I might have to slow down and sort of feel my way through it in order to make that work. Finally, the kill chain is going to be really important. We're going to remember this when we get to talking about the kill chain. So, you know, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, not so much. There's a lot of engineering stuff that has to happen in order to make stealth in space work. And there's a lot of specific assumptions that you have to talk about. So let's talk about hydrodynamics. Basically, a long ship will be a fast ship. So that's why aircraft carriers can just leave all the escorts in the dust. That and the fact they're nuclear powered, but as much as anything, it's that it's a big ship. So you use proportionally more power to move a small ship fast than you do a long, large ship, right? So larger ships are more efficient, is basically what that boils down to. Propulsive power increases as the cube of the the speed, which means that ships have a natural top speed. You get to the point where you can dramatically increase the size of the engines and the ship won't go any faster. It just won't, right? And I give this quote down at the bottom from Robert O'Connell's Sacred Vessels. Now, the reason why there's an asterisk at the end is he's actually, I think, got that wrong. I've never found a source that says that the difference between those two ships was 1 knot. I think it's actually 3 knots of difference between those ships. Now, it's still pretty significant. You go from you have to go from 43,000 to 70,000 shaft horsepower to get 3 knots of speed. So that's still a pretty significant difference, but I think O'Connell's wrong about this. I'll note, don't bother buying this book. O'Connell's wrong about most things in this book. It's a really bad book. Page 47 is the best page in this book, and he gets stuff wrong on this page all over the place. So just don't buy this book. This is also sort of why airplanes are faster than ships, because there's less drag in the atmosphere than there is on the surface of the ocean, and airplanes have a top speed too. So, you know, you get to the point where you dramatically have to increase the size of the engines to go faster. You have to dramatically increase the power output. It's still easier to do that with airplanes than it is with ships. So what happens when you combine hydrodynamics with history? This is where battleships and battle cruisers, where that split around World War I came from, in that you're balancing off speed and armor and guns. You're trying to find your optimal situation for balancing those off. And in World War I, there was this big debate whether you optimize in favor of having speed or whether you optimize in favor of having armor. And they tried both ways. If you optimized for speed, you got battle cruisers. If you optimized for armor, you got battleships. Well, by World War II, the ships had gotten bigger, so their propulsion plants were bigger. Remember, like if you double the length of the dimensions of the ship, the volume goes up by a factor of 8, not a factor of 2, because it's 2 by 2 by 2 is 8. So remember Oklahoma, a World War I era ship, in Wisconsin? So you've dramatically increased the size of the propulsion plant, but after a point, extra propulsion doesn't help you. After a point, you're just, you know, it's just not worth the effort anymore. So by World War II, ships had really gotten to the point where they were on a different part of that curve. And it no longer made sense to try to go faster. Instead, let's make the armor better. Let's make the guns better. Let's do other things to increase the subdivision, which is another form of protection, but that takes up weight because you're putting more bulkheads in and more watertight doors and stuff like that. And as a result of that, battle cruisers weren't so much proven wrong as they just kind of went away, as you didn't need to really think about battle cruisers anymore. The Iowa-class battleship is arguably both a battleship and a battle cruiser by World War I terms. It's about as fast as you can get. Back in World War II, a fast ship was 32 knots. Today, a fast ship is 32 knots. You've really gotten to the point where, because of drag functions, you really just can't go any faster. Now, you should, of course, keep in mind the Brits, the Germans, and Americans all meant different things when they said battle cruiser. The Brits weren't even consistent. It changed over time. And Jackie Fisher, the guy who really sort of promulgated the idea of the battle cruiser, wasn't consistent when he said. He had a tendency to spitball answers. He had a tendency to optimize his argument for the ears of whoever he was talking to at the time. So he'd emphasize different things, et cetera, and he'd sort of he'd speculate out loud, like, well, maybe we could do this and maybe we could do that. And as a result, trying to figure out exactly what Jackie Fisher meant by a battle cruiser can be hard. We do know speed is armor. He was consistent about saying speed is armor and we should be going for speed rather than armor. And, we should be building battle cruisers rather than battleships. But there were German ships that we called battle cruisers, and they looked a lot different than the British battle cruisers. So it's important to understand all that stuff. All right, so now I'm going to talk about kill chains a little bit. So kill chain is just a sequence of steps necessary to hit a target. So in its simplest form, find, fix, finish, right? Find where the target is, fix its position. So, hey, there's a target out there, fix its position, and then finish is to actually take the shot and kill it. So you can sort of think of this as like if you're out, you got binoculars, you're out looking around in the woods, like maybe you're bird watching or something. As a general rule, you might do the scan with the binoculars, but you might also look around with your eyes, trying to see if you can see some motion or something like that. And then when you see something, then you pull up the binoculars and take a look at it with that. So you're cueing yourself, right? You're using your sort of wide field of view sensor, the Mark 1 Mod 0 eyeball, and then you use your binoculars to get a narrower field, but you get a more precise answer in that. And then if you're actually got a guy with a rifle next to you because you're spotting for a sniper, then he can take the shot with his very, very fine field of view sensor and his weapon that he can put a round on target. So you can think about kill chains in a number of ways, depending upon the sensors, weapons, platforms, and targets that are involved. A lot of this is sensor driven. Like the one I'm most familiar with is the ASW kill chain. And that's really kind of sensor driven. As a general rule, exceptions to this rule depends upon how close you are to the target, et cetera, but you've got sensors that are really only good for detection. You've got sensors that are sort of optimized for tracking. Then you have to identify a target. Like you don't really identify a target using radar. You might detect it on radar because it's stuck a periscope up, but you usually identify it with something else. You identify it visually, or you identify it by listening to it and you go, okay, yeah, that sounds like such and such. A localization sensor, which is, you'll see that only the ASW kill chain has that, and that's because the weapons are so short ranged and are so dependent upon a precise placement. You don't really send an ASW weapon and say, I'm just going to sort of shoot in that direction and I'll see what it finds, right? There's a joke about the harpoon missile that when the harpoon goes into the mailbox, the address is to whom it may concern. You don't really do that with torpedoes so much, especially air-launched torpedoes, because they're just so small, they just don't have the legs to do that type of search. So you really kind of have to localize it down, and then you have to attack it. And I like the fact that the ballistic missile defense kill chain has the word kill in it, because you still have to actually hit the target, right? And so you have to follow all these steps approximately in order. You might have the identification from an earlier encounter, and or you've got extra intel that tells you there is a Brazilian submarine in the area, and so we're going to track the Brazilian submarine because we're doing an exercise with them. And so you've got a pretty good idea of what the ID is in advance, et cetera, et cetera. So, you may not do all of these in the exact order, and sometimes you get lucky. I knew somebody that went right to the localization step because they turned on their magnetic anomaly detector when they were just to see if it was working that day, because it was a sort of cranky piece of equipment, and they happened to get a hit, and it happened to be the submarine they were looking for in this exercise. Shit happens, right? Sometimes you get lucky. But as a general rule, you start on the left and you go through these steps. And if you've done all the steps correctly, and there's a target out there to find, and the target isn't able to get away from you, in the end, you drop a weapon and you kill it. So let's go through a little example of this. I did a little bit of this already when I started talking about ASW. So detection might be long range using the sound observation system. So I forget exactly what SOSA stands for, but it's something, yes, sound surveillance system, sorry. Or some other national asset. You've got a series of acoustic detections. So you're listening with your sonar, and you might get radar hits if it's a submarine that has to stick a mast up, like a periscope or a snorkel. You might listen to it to analyze the tonals. Those are very specific frequencies that are caused by rotating machinery. So you can hear the turbine spinning, and it spins at a particular frequency. And if you got these frequency lines, these frequency lines match up to this. It's basically the idea of an acoustic spectrum, like spectral lines. It's the same idea, but with acoustics. You localize, you use a magnetic anomaly detector, an airplane flies over. MAD has a very, very short range. The bad part about MAD is that it's got a short range. The good part about MAD is that it's got a short range. If I detect something on MAD, it's within weapons range. Otherwise, I wouldn't have detected it. And then you drop the weapon and then you've killed it, right? Well, okay, if the weapon drop is correct and there might be some time between when you localized and when you drop the weapon might be coming from somebody else. A helicopter comes in because the airplane doesn't have a weapon, and maybe you don't quite have it on that anymore. They can do things, they can do decoys. It may detonate but not be close enough to do damage. So killing it is still difficult, and this all takes time to run through all this stuff. Even if you get that detection really fast, it still takes time, and you probably aren't going to get that detection fast. So it also helps to know your enemy. So let's take a quick look at this, right? These are the alien fighters from Independence Day. You're Will Smith, you're an F-18 pilot, and you fly out there to defend the planet Earth from these guys, and you've got an infrared missile. You've got the latest version of the AIM-9 infrared missile. This thing is just, it's a laser beam in terms of its practicality in dealing with Russian airplanes and Chinese airplanes and airplanes of anybody else. It's a death ray. You've got this thing. It's a functional equivalent of a death ray. You're probably not going to be able to shoot these things down. Why do you think that is? Well, and I'm not even talking about their maneuverability, etc. You probably aren't going to be able to get a lock on this thing. And the reason why you can't get a lock is because your weapon thinks it's a decoy. And that's because we've made our weapons smart by making them dumb. We've made our weapons smart by making them not particularly flexible for very good reasons. Infrared missiles are invented. We're going to home in on the heat of a jet engine. So they start dumping out flares. The targets start dumping out flares. And it's like, oh, that thing's hot. I'm going to go, that thing's hotter. I'm going to follow that. Well, okay, we don't want it to follow the flare. So we'll change our infrared seeker so that the infrared seeker is looking for 2 different frequencies of heat. Okay, well then we'll have 2 different frequencies. Well, they got to be the right frequencies. Okay, we'll create a flare that has the right frequencies. So every time you do one of these move counter move steps, you make your seeker A, better able to detect and lock onto a jet engine, and B, less able to detect on the alien fighters and lock onto the alien fighters, because these things don't have jet engines. So you break that kill chain by making sure that you can't target it. You can't target, and hence you can't engage. So knowing your enemy is really important. Are you going to know your enemy in a science fiction context? Probably not. So I'm going to talk about something I call a useful observation. This is from the design notes for Star Cruiser by GDW, which I think these notes were written by Frank Chadwick since he did most of the rest of the game. He basically says tactical combat is about targeting. There are 2 ways to improve targeting. You can increase the precision of fire. You can increase the volume of fire. So you can shoot better or you can shoot more. You can increase your precision of fire by improving your knowledge of the enemy position. So I've got a better idea of exactly where I need to hit. My weapon performance, so maybe, I rifle the barrel of my gun so that the bullet is more stable in flight and it flies in a straighter line. Or I have better weapon control. Like maybe I put a scope on it so I can aim better. Or, maybe I put iron sights on it so I can aim better. Maybe I teach my people to aim better. On the defense, you've got a couple of different options you can do. You can decrease the precision of fire, and you can do that through electronic countermeasures or through decoys or camouflage, et cetera, et cetera. You can make it harder to be hit. Or you can decrease the effective volume of fire. You can decrease the number of effective shots by armoring so that most of those shots don't count anymore because they just bounce off. So this little essay in the designer notes for Star Cruiser, I think, does an excellent job of describing the targeting problem and describing the tactical problem as a result of that. And it's really interesting in that Bob Work, who was Undersecretary of the Navy at the time and later became the Deputy Secretary of Defense, he did a presentation called Air-Sea Battle, Power Projection in the Mature Guided Munitions Era that was essentially this. It's almost exactly what he was saying. He also talked about nuclear weapons, which are kind of interesting. But you know, I remember reading this, and Bob Work is really big into wargaming, and you know, I'm actually in a position where I probably could send. I've got Bob Work's email address. I probably could send him an email and say, "Hey, just out of curiosity, did you ever read this, and did this get you thinking about the targeting problem?" He's a very sharp guy, and he's a wargamer, so maybe he did.
So, Chris, we have a question.
Okay.
Where would speed as armor fit in?
That would be a decreasing the. You know, it's actually funny because it's probably decreasing precision of fire rather than you know. So it doesn't work like regular armor in that regard. It's not decreasing the effective volume because they're not bouncing off. It's decreasing the precision of the fire. And that's because you're moving, they're moving, you're at least one or the other of you is probably maneuvering in addition to just you moving, right? So as a result of that, you've got bearing changes, et cetera, et cetera. There's a time of flight on shells if you're firing like battleship shells, et cetera. So I'm largely thinking about this as a battleship problem. There's a time of flight involved in all of that. There's a time to sort of mechanically calculate things by turning the knobs and to mechanically move everything. So there's a time delay in there. Plus there's a level of precision involved with that. So, I mean, so when you do all that stuff, it's always easier if the bearing doesn't change and you're just kind of trying to zero in on it, right? It's harder if all the variables are changing and you're trying to keep up with it. So speed puts you in a situation where you're trying to keep up with it. I hope that answered the question. All right, so let's look at some science fiction models of space warfare. First, I'm going to define what I mean by a model. Then I'm going to talk about some of the notional attributes of space combat, just sort of put a straw man model up for what I think science fiction space combat might look like, heavily assumptions dependent. I'm going to look at some terrestrial models of naval warfare, and then I'm going to kind of compare all those. So by model, I mean just a simplified representation or description of a system or complex entity. I don't even remember where I got that definition, but basically, you know, I'm making something that is representative of a larger whole. It's not the larger whole. If it was, it wouldn't be a model. It would be the thing, right? There's an old Stephen Wright joke about I have a model, a life-size, I have a life-size model of the United States. I keep it everywhere. So when you get to the point where your model is 100% accurate, it's no longer a model, it is the thing. So models are relevant for what they're trying to represent. If you want to look at the physical outside form of something, you know, it doesn't have to have any guts. The model kits that we made as kids, they don't, no, I got a model airplane. It doesn't actually fly. It doesn't have weapons. It doesn't have any of those things, right? So in this case, what I'm talking about for a model, it's like I'm looking at what the author or the other content creators trying to base a science fiction navy on. So I already said that I think that a lot of these times are just running it through the science fiction converter, maybe without even turning it on first, and just adding in space onto the end. No model is a 100% conversion. None of these are going to be exactly right. I mean, there might be a few out there. Star Wars is pretty close with some of the stuff. But you're always going to be able to say, yeah, but you know, in the terrestrial model, you talk about X is true, and in this thing here, you know, in this particular world, Y, that's not true. It's Y instead. It's like, yeah, okay, yeah, I'll grant you that. There's always going to be places where it doesn't quite match, but by and large, you can sort of look at it and go, yeah, they were really kind of describing submarines in space there, right? So that's what I'm basically looking at. So let's take a look at what I think are some notional attributes of space combat. So first of all, you've only really got one medium. Okay, maybe you've got hyperspace that the space submarines can hang out in or something like that. But yeah, in general, let's talk about something that's really only kind of got one medium. Hiding is relatively hard, you know, despite what I said about the stealth in space is, you know, there is no stealth in space. I don't believe that's true, but I also believe that it actually is kind of hard to hide, because you can't hide behind the horizon, you can't hide behind the interface. Unlimited line of sight means you usually have a long time to look. If you've got a faster than light drive with speed of light sensors, that might not be true, but in some cases it is, right? Because unless he sees you, he may pop in long enough away that you see him in a relevant time frame that you can start maneuvering, and now you're both jumping around doing stuff, and it's hard to find either one of you. But as a general rule, though, you've got long looks, so hiding probably is pretty hard. Hydrodynamics is not a factor here. You don't have top speeds that are caused by the fact that you're moving through the medium. Now, you might have things like, in Star Trek, warp drive kind of works like it's moving through a medium. In a lot of ways, it does. It's moving through the medium of subspace. It's manipulating the medium of subspace. There might as well be a space propeller on the back in some ways. So sometimes you can recreate that effect with a particular set of assumptions, but it's not really sort of the default. Top speed is really determined by the size of your fuel tank. If you're operating in anything that looks like real physics, you just keep accelerating, and you eventually get to the point where you run out of fuel, or relativistic effects start coming in. Or in the case of Honor Harrington, and I've got an Honor Harrington backdrop on this, you run into the problem where you don't want to go any faster than a certain speed because your particle shielding can't handle all the space dust. And so you sort of you've got a top speed that's caused by I don't want to blow up my ship sort of thing. I would argue that ship killing weapons are probable in a science fiction space combat environment, because the kinetics of space flight and the energies needed for all this stuff means that, you're talking about being able to get things up to tens, if not hundreds, if not thousands, if not more than that, kilometers per second. And, at that speed, a bullet becomes, you go fast enough, a bullet's an atom bomb. But remember, this is all assumptions dependent, right? I can come up with a set of assumptions that make any of this work. This is just a straw man to compare it against. I'm not saying that this is the right model. I'm saying this is just kind of like, this is the lens I want to look through some models at. So let's I'm going to look at the following real world models in science fiction. I'm going to look at surface and undersea and carrier. I'm not really going to look at air warfare, because fighters in space is almost always really done as aircraft carriers in space. So I'm going to punt to the next model for that. So let's take a look at surface warfare. And so I'm kind of using Honor Harrington as the straw man here. One medium versus one medium. Yeah, they can fight in hyperspace, but they usually don't. So by and large, it's one medium versus one medium. Hiding is generally hard in Honor Harrington, but it's generally easy in surface warfare, because you can just sort of, if you're close enough in most surface warfare, you can just use binoculars. Ship types, David was very clearly borrowing from surface combat in regard to this. Not only can you read it in the books, but I've had that conversation with him. Also, he's got a specific reason why there's dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts and battleships, et cetera, et cetera. He's actually thought it through. I've had the conversation about, these don't exist in all at the same time. And he's thought it through, and he's got really good arguments as to why they all exist in his universe. And it's not about the type of job they do. It's about real world type concerns, like as technology progressed, the ships got bigger and they were able to move to the next level. But they, like the folks that built dreadnoughts and then moved to super dreadnoughts, the dreadnoughts were still useful, and they would decommission them as they built super dreadnoughts. But in the short term, they had we need more hulls problem. And so they weren't willing to get rid of the dreadnoughts until they had something to replace them with. In the case of the battleships, the People's Republic of Haven had battleships, and that was largely because when super dreadnoughts came around, they decided to keep their battleships because they had an internal security problem. And while battleships didn't work, you wouldn't want to send them off as a first line ship of the line to fight the Manties. They were perfectly capable of making sure that uppity local governments didn't get any ideas, and they were perfectly capable of being an internal police force, and that's how they used them. It was a bad day when one of those battleships found itself accidentally fighting dreadnoughts or super dreadnoughts. You didn't, in surface combat, you usually don't have one-shot ship killers, right? You usually need to have multiple shots. Sometimes you get lucky. Same is true in Honor Harrington. Endurance is a little bit different between the two. So for undersea, the undersea warfare model, 2300, I earlier did the 2300 designer's notes from Frank Chadwick. 2300 is a really good model for that. You know, undersea warfare in the modern age, you have to be concerned with air and surface in addition to subsurface, whereas in 2300, you really only have the one medium. You can maybe make some arguments that I haven't fully thought through, that the shelf, if you're on the FTL shelf versus being off the FTL shelf, that those are actually two different medium because they have such dramatic effects in terms of how your space drive works. You can almost make the idea that if you're off the shelf, it's like being in the air, and if you're on the shelf, it's like being in the water. It's an imperfect analogy, but it's useful to think in those terms, I think. Hiding is generally easy in 2300. You've got unfettered line of sight. You've got a very capable drive system. Your sensors are limited to speed of light, with one exception, if I remember correctly, which is a very fuzzy sensor. Ship types are kind of similar. One ship killers are very normal in undersea warfare. Like one torpedo is generally all you need. Same is true in 2300. Like I said, let's cover this under carriers. So in carrier warfare in World War II, it's really air and surface. Now, there was a submarine threat out there. Aircraft carriers were targets. They weren't really participants in that. Okay, escort carriers in the North Atlantic convoys, that's a different situation. That's not really carrier warfare. That's really ASW warfare that just happened to have some airplanes involved, but those airplanes aren't shooting at other airplanes. They're not attacking other ships. They're really only attacking submarines. That's a special case. So compared to Battlestar Galactica, I'm looking specifically at the 1970s one in this regard. You've only got the one medium. I think hiding is hard in that universe. I think it's really kind of hard to tell. Ship types, you know, there's nothing that really looks like an escort in the 1970s show. In the 2004 show, maybe you sort of, every now and then you get indication of other ships. You know that they had other ships, at least the colonials did, and they've got the names that make them sound like they're escorts, but there isn't a really good definition of what those ships did. I don't know if they're escorts. I don't know what they do. I don't know what their mission was. So you're really kind of limited in the type of ships that you've got. One-shot ship killers seem to be unusual for large ships. They really sort of seem, in the 1970s show, they're whittling their targets to death by pew-pewing them with lasers, right? At the very end of the series, we see that they've got these Titan-like ballistic missiles that the Battlestars can fire, but you never see any indication of that until that episode. You just don't see them. That's not how the Cylons killed the fleet. The Cylons killed them by pew-pew-pewing them, and that just doesn't really make sense to me. Let's see, I'm looking at captains in Star Trek have to make a lot of independent decisions, although that sort of changes over time. Later on, they're on the radio all the time and they're in real-time communication. But there's at least one instance in Balance of Terror, Kirk sends a message back that says, basically, I'm about to start a war, are you guys okay with that? And luckily, he was able to stop the war from happening. Eventually, Starfleet came back and said, okay, I guess we're okay with that. Because, you know, by that point, it's probably either started or it hasn't. So let's compare these models real quick. So there's some problems with the next slide, just to be aware. I'm not controlling for time periods. There's some real dangers of apples and oranges comparison here. The space combat model is vague. It could change along the margins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of this is assumptions dependent. Take everything with a grain of salt. I'm not trying to put my thumb on the scale for any of this. I'm just trying to present some information on this and give you sort of an idea of how I put it all together. But you know, this is something we could spend an entire time having an argument about this next slide if we wanted to. So I'll leave this up for just a second. So take a look at how I sort of put all this together to compare those models. And these are sort of like the original models, comparing the various real world models to my notional space combat models, not the science fiction models per se. It's also worth remembering that in space, by definition, you've got closed systems. They're closed most of the time. That doesn't mean they don't get supplies, but there is no closed system on planet Earth. Even submarines are not closed systems. They use water for cooling. They use water for propulsion. They use water to make their oxygen, right? So they are not spacecraft in that regard. They're the closest thing we've got to spacecraft in terms of terrestrial vehicles, but they're really not spacecraft in that regard. They're very much take advantage of their environment in a way. Spacecraft are entirely about overcoming their environment. Submarines have a big element of that too, but they're also about using their environment to accomplish the goal. So, okay, so a few conclusions. I'm going to look at the bottom line up front, and then there's going to be some implications, some takeaways, et cetera, and I'll talk to you about, a little bit about reading, and then we'll have a few minutes left for questions. So this is the bottom line up front. Remember this, I said, most SF navies are conversions of terrestrial navies, not products of their environment, whereas terrestrial navies are products of their environment. Most of the science fiction models have a tendency to sort of pull from different historical time periods, but there's no single correct answer, and it's highly assumptions dependent. What are the implications for fighters? It's unclear to me why fighters, in terms of a fighter carrier, would make sense in a space environment. This is often, I think, made worse by the fact that, you know, what do you arm these things with? Battlestar Galactica is really kind of like, I'm going to attack enemy ships with a Wildcat fighter armed with 50 caliber guns. So I'm not going to use battleships with 16-inch guns. I'm going to go shoot it with 50 cals. So that never really struck me as being a good model. I think that torpedo boats and torpedo boat carriers might be a better model. Now, in the real world, torpedo boats are not particularly effective. And that's largely because they're so small, they've got such poor sea-keeping capabilities. They have to deal with weather and all the rest of it. The end result of that, it's just, they're slower than they should be. They're very susceptible to the weather. They don't have a lot of space for sensors. They're just kind of underperforming. But if you don't have any of those weather factors in space. So, you know, a torpedo boat and a torpedo boat carrier might actually work in a way that it didn't work on planet Earth the only time we ever tried this, which the French tried it. They took a light cruiser and they turned it into a torpedo boat carrier. They later turned that same ship into a seaplane carrier, and it worked a little bit better as a seaplane carrier. So, as I said earlier, aircraft carriers are fundamentally a mechanism for transitioning between the sea and sky, right? Air and sea have different fundamental characteristics. Aircraft carriers are a way of having our cake and eating it too, and using the fundamental characteristics of those two different media to our advantage. It's unclear at best why you would do that in space, because you don't have to have a flight deck that drives the problem. Everything about that function of an aircraft carrier it points towards making a big ship that you can put a whole bunch of airplanes on. You don't have to do that in space. You can launch the thing just by pushing it out and letting it drift away, right? Pushing the fighter out and letting it drift away. So why would you put everything all in one basket? Well, you might still do that for economy of scale purposes and because it's easier to defend it that way. Or you might decide to not put all your eggs in one basket, and maybe the right answer is a squadron here, a squadron there. It's, you know, split it all up. And if you need to use fighters, then okay. You can sort of have them congregate. A lot of that depends upon what exactly are those fighters doing. Are those fighters, are they the main striking arm? Or do you want to send in an alpha strike where you send everything you can at once? Or do you want to sort of keep it, you know, are fighters there to do some other task? Like, are they there to shoot down incoming missiles? Okay, if they're there to shoot down incoming missiles, then maybe you don't want to put them all in one place. You want to put them around the targets. Okay, so it really kind of depends. But here's what I hope you take away from all this. Many of the historical models that we've talked about, they're all problematic to some degree. The idea that you just run it through the science fiction converter means that it's really not a product of its environment. And so, there are cracks there. I'm not saying don't enjoy it. I'm saying that there's some places where it doesn't work. There's lots of different places where a conversation like this could continue, and I try doing that. I try talking about all these different things. There's a few sources that I find especially interesting. Babylon 5, I already showed you a picture of Babylon 5 a couple of slides ago because there's a fighter complement for most capital ships. CJ Cherry's Alliance Union works. She uses naval and aviation terminology with the ranks and calls them carriers and, et cetera, et cetera. But it really is the closest thing I've seen to sort of a sui generis system, right? That it isn't just a naval model with the serial numbers filed off. Those ships don't act like a naval model, right? They just don't. And as a result, they fit within their environment pretty well. I personally really like books with tactical FTL, but speed of light sensors and comms, because that I find creates a very interesting tactical situation. Star Trek has this tendency of, I got the magic FTL drive, I'm going to use the magic sensors to counteract the magic FTL drive. If I need some other magic, I'll just, cross wire the photon torpedoes through the transporter, and I've got the next level of magic on it, right? So I kind of like models that are less magical in that regard. And here's a couple of books that fit that requirement. I also really like Scott Geyer's Ganellan series because he really adopts this torpedo boat in space model. The carriers carry vessels that they call corvettes that have a crew of about 10. And they also have their own little shuttle. And so the carriers are the FTL vessel, and the other the corvettes are not FTL capable, but they're the main offensive punch. So he really's got this. It is a carrier model in that the beef that they have with them is carried by these carried craft, but they're not fighters per se. So if you really want to dive into thinking about how navies apply, this is a model of how you design a navy, what the different parts are, from strategic assumptions, big picture on the one side, all the way down to personnel policies and stuff on the other side. Most science fiction only looks at a handful of the stuff in the middle and sort of ignores the ends. And even then, there's not a whole lot of focus on most of these things in most works. If you go to House of Steel, the Honorverse Companion, I did a write-up of this with David Weber where we specifically looked at the Honorverse as an example. So in the time we have left, does anybody have any questions? Yeah, Bob says that the Raptors are closer to the torpedo boat model, and the new Galactica is kind of interesting in that they had a severe weapon shortage while they're going on with all of this. So you sort of got the impression that there's things that they would be doing normally that they weren't because they didn't have enough weapons. I really wish that the plan had been a better movie, because it seemed to me all along that there's something going on there, right? I would love to have seen an episode, maybe 4 episodes in, right? And remember those early episodes especially, they're all happening like boom, 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 right? They're, like you're seeing, you've got like those first 4 episodes take place in the space of, I think, like 2 days. At some point when they get a little bit of a breathing room, Adama and Ty should have a conversation where one of them goes, "Why aren't we dead yet?" And the other one goes, "Yeah, I've been thinking about that myself." Because the Cylons had such an incredible technological edge on them. They basically had nuclear capable kamikazes that wouldn't die in the process. And they had a tactically useful FTL drive. I mean, we saw them do a jump immediately after another jump, and we saw them, there was every reason to think that they could do something in a situation where they could get inside the screen and be able to put a nuke on the hull of the Galactica without Galactica being able to stop it. And yet they never did that. If I had the capabilities the Cylons did, that show would have ended halfway through the first season at the latest. Unless they had a plan, unless there was some reason where they weren't actually trying to kill them. And it would have been interesting if they had thought that through before the show started, and the revelation of that had been part of the show, as opposed to just sort of like having this made-for-TV movie that comes out.
So for the record, Chris, when they did Galactica 1889, they actually asked that question about why they weren't dead yet. But that was so far down chain, it didn't matter.
Galactica 1889?
The one where they found Earth. Excuse me, 1980.
Oh.
Galactica 1980. I misspoke.
That's when they actually came out and said that the Cylons were using the humanity as a test vehicle.
Okay, so I have no idea what you're talking about, and wouldn't it have been great if they'd made a sequel to Highlander also?
Yes.
Yeah. The story of Galactica 1980 is really amazing. Nobody wanted that show. ABC didn't want to do it. Glenn Larson didn't want to do it. The showrunners didn't want to do it. But it all happened because the FCC was pressuring ABC to have more kids shows. And so ABC went to Glenn Larson and said, if you don't do this, we'll never buy another show from you again. And Glenn Larson went to the two of his writers and said, if you don't do this, we'll never buy another show from you, another script from you again. And so everybody cheered when the show got canceled.
So that's why they did the Galactic Boy Scouts routine with all the Galactica kids that got stranded on Earth.
Yeah. And so the two showrunners are were Alan Cole and Chris Bunch, the same guys that later did the Sten series.
Which is very good.
And so one of them has passed away. One of them was married to the other one's sister, if I remember correctly, and one of them passed away. I can't remember which one. And they did hundreds of TV scripts. If you watch TV from like the mid 70s to the mid 80s, pay attention to who wrote the script. They're all over the place. They wrote for everybody. And they wrote a lot of stuff for Glenn Larson. And they eventually, Glenn Larson basically blackmailed them into doing it, extorted them into doing the show, and they were happy as anybody when it got canceled.
So
yeah, Merle says that Chris is the one that passed.
Yeah. So Chris, have you given much thought to the sci-fi variants that basically say you're faster than light between systems, but once you're in system, your speed of light is slower? Because there are a lot of plot complications and obstacles that I think come in, because you see this kind of stuff in The Expanse and some of the other programs, but I'm not sure that they've done that particularly well either. It's something I wondered if you thought about.
Yeah, it gets, once you get, depends on how you do it. Yeah, so like if it's like you come in through a jump point, or if you come in through a specific jump point, now you've got something that can be attacked or defended, right? That specific point. If you just have to come in the outer system for whatever reason, then effectively everything that happens in the inner system is as if you had no FTL drive. And if you're relatively slow coming through, you've got time to develop a sensor picture, et cetera, et cetera. So in that cases, stealth in space is hard, especially if, like in The Expanse, you got magic fusion torches all over the place. In most cases, you're going to see the guy coming, right? And so maybe sometimes you can coast and not be seen and try to go as dark as you can, but in a lot of cases you're going to have time to see them coming. I'll also note that if you're in a situation like that, you're going to develop your weapon systems with a certain set of assumptions, right? Like your ships might be bigger because they're not going to have to do very fast spin maneuvers, because you're going to be able to set this thing up weeks in advance. You're going to know exactly when the combat's going to take place. There's going to be no surprises. Whereas if you're in a situation where you might be jumping around, et cetera, and you don't have some magic inertial compensator, you might want your ships to be you might want them to be small, and you might want all your weapon systems to be able to react very fast, because you're not going to have time to take long looks at stuff. You're going to have to very quickly react. And there's some interesting things if you're in a technological transition between one of those periods and another period that you can do. 2300 is very interesting in that they've got this idea of the FTL shelf, which is basically your drive crosses certain gravitational thresholds, at which point it becomes massively less efficient. So you slow down. And so like if you want to go from one side of the solar system to the other, and you're at Earth, you probably want to go out first and then go around and then come in. That's probably going to be faster than trying to cut through this. Well, you obviously wouldn't go through the sun. The shortest path isn't always the fastest. And so you could potentially end up with some situations where, depending upon where the defenses are and where exactly the shelf is, you can be at a real advantage or a real disadvantage, right? Nobody can sneak up on you because they have to come out of fast, and you can always plot the intercept, especially if you've got ships on the outside that can collapse in. Or if you're close to the edge of the shelf, they can drop right in on top of you, and you won't see them until they arrive. You might have a vague idea that they're coming. So a lot of these things fit. I put them in the same category as water depth, shoal water, right? I'd like to go here. I can't because I've got land in that direction, right? If I had the old Royal Navy toast of a willing foe and sea room is room to maneuver. I may not have room to maneuver because I've got some gravitational anomaly. I've got a planet. I'm defending a planet or something. And as a result, I'm kind of anchored to a situation. All of those things factor into this. So let's see. Any other questions? I think I got time for one more real quick, real quick. Okay, maybe I don't. All right, then. I tell you what, everybody, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much to Brant, if he's listening, for inviting me to do this. Now I think it's probably time for us to all leave, and have Merle end the session so that Brant can reuse it for the next session. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.